All right, you heard that. It's time to get going. Welcome, welcome for a Tuesday afternoon. Today, we're going to finish up the ancient media part of our program, and we'll finish up with the First Amendment. And what we will do today is, again, finish up with the talk part. Thursday, we will do an in-class project, so please try to show up, on applying the First Amendment and what it means in the modern world on campuses. So we'll do a little work group discussion. You will get 5 points for doing it, for just giving it a shot. So that's what we'll do. Anyway, so that we'll do that. And then next week, no, not today. That's Tuesday. I mean, Thursday. No, Thursday. And I will make an announcement. So that way, everybody who's involved can, and if you can't show up on Thursday, we can make arrangements. I'm not going to penalize anybody. Speaking of which, this also means as we finish up this unit, there will be a test next week. Tuesday, we'll do a review sheet, but this time, because people had some issues with the last one, what I will do is make sure that many of the questions will be directly from the review sheet, from the books. There will be a little less application and a little bit more memory. So that way, that'll get the grades up. Again, I don't want to hurt anybody. I want you to do everything I can to make sure that you understand and appreciate the media, free speech, and where we are. But I also know that this is a gen ed class, and a lot of you are hello. Do I hear somebody? Somebody needs to be muted. Okay, dokes. Hey, I'm still getting the hang of this too, as you can see. It's okay. So, in class, applied First Amendment, 5-point extra credit on Thursday. Test next week, meaning test review Thursday, and the test itself will be Wednesday through Friday online. So that's what we're going to do over the next couple of days, and I'll put that in writing shortly. See, again, getting the ins and outs of the protocols of online is something we're all adjusting to all the time. Anyway, today, it's time to do the share screen. Okay, we are sharing. Okay. Here's the American Revolution. Remember last time we talked about how America became, the English colonies became this hotbed of free speech because, and this will come up on the test, we're far away from the king, but you had an educated, literate populace who's staying here as opposed to folks in Canada or Mexico who did not have as much of a educated and permanent population. The English came to stay. So and then a lot more literacy. We talked about Ben Franklin. And then in free speech, you have the Zenger trial. John Peter Zenger was a printer who printed an article in his newspaper critical of the governor. The governor tried to put him in jail. There was a jury trial, and the jury said out of the blue, hey, the governor is a crook. And if truth, and you can speak truth to power, that you can say bad things about the governor if it's true. And the whole idea is truth, of truth being a reason to protest power is a huge thing that started with the Zenger trial in the English colonies. And that whole ferment really was going on for the next 40 years. The colonies became more independent. But, and then the revolution started in the 1750s. But would you have joined?
Newspapers had a
during
variety of impacts on the war,
What the
but I
media
think the
did.
primary one is the fact that they kept people engaged in the war, even when the fighting was far away, because people really wanted to know what was going on. They wanted to know about the battles and who was winning and who was losing, and newspapers were the #1 source for them to gain that information. And
so you had a literate population, they're all reading. So they're keeping up with what's going on.
And I mean, it's really pretty amazing when you think about it. I mentioned that, you know, the Boston Gazette and the Massachusetts Spy were important newspapers all the way through the war. There wasn't much fighting in Massachusetts after 1776, but the people remained interested. They wanted to know what was going on, and the newspapers were their source for that information. And that's true through all the colonies. For them to know what was going on in New York or Boston or, you know, South Carolina when the fighting went south, the newspapers provided the information.
So the press, the media kept the country together. People in Boston were interested in what was going on in South Carolina. There was a battle right here on Lookout Mountain where Chief Dragging Canoe chased off the British. So people all over were interested in what was going on everywhere else. And that helped pull these 13 different colonies together into one nation. But while it's the colonies, got to think of a few things.
Although I haven't taken an official survey, I'm pretty sure if you asked the average US president if they would have joined the American Revolution back in the 1770s, the answers of America, heck yes, and I don't know, maybe not, would be based on our current feelings about the US. But before we dive into history, there are some important things to remember for this particular thought exercise. First, in the 1770s, there was no way of knowing if this crazy revolution idea would work. There are lots of ways you could end up dead, either from fighting, sickness, or being killed for treason. And second, no one is American. There is no United States, and you are a British colonist or an adjacent group. And finally, although it's easy now to imagine that in our past lives we were all George Washington or the folks living in the fancy upstairs part of the house on Downton Abbey, chances were we would have been just a part of the larger population. So you have to put yourself in the uncomfortable shoes of the average Josiah or Jacoba and ask, when the conflict broke out, who would you have been? So you could have been on a list that's not all-encompassing, an enslaved African-American laborer, Native American, women from all backgrounds, a white landowning man, or a non-property owner.
See, at that time, that's why I like to show this, people originally thought of themselves as British. Remember, Ben Franklin did. And of the people that were around, you had African Americans, many of whom were enslaved, Native Americans, many of whom didn't like the colonists and worked for the British, women who had no rights at all, white men with no property, they didn't have rights. The only people who had any rights at all were white male landowners. Right. Thank you, Quentin. Those were all the colonists.
owning white colonists, also a man. So let's start with imagining that you
Okay,
were an
so
African.
I just wanted to throw that in there. That not everybody was included. Still, you had the white male educated landowners started to think, maybe we don't need to be colonists. Well, that was kind of fuzzy. When the revolution started, mostly it was a tax rebellion. The whole idea of being a separate country, again, supported by the press, really kind of came from the media.
Have you ever read anything that has changed your beliefs? Can a book spark a revolution and change the course of history? The battles of Lexington and Concord in 1775 initially were fights by American colonists against their British leaders for better treatment. Still considering themselves fundamentally English, the colonists weren't thinking about full-scale independence from England. At least, not until Thomas Paine wrote and published the revolutionary pamphlet, Common Sense. In late 1775, after the battles of Lexington and Concord occurred, Thomas Paine, a 38-year-old English widower living in Philadelphia, lifted his pen to ponder why the British king had the authority to rule over people simply based on his birth. Wouldn't a republican government be more just than control by one man? Isn't equality among all citizens righteous and fair? Shouldn't America be its own country, governed by its own people, free from the tyranny of an oppressive king across the ocean? Published on January 9, 1776, Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, was the first publication to advocate for independence from England. It was a hit. Copies of the book sold all over the colonies. More importantly, the ideas within spread rapidly.
Before Paine, before Common Sense, most people, most of the colonists thought of themselves as British citizens. It was Paine in Common Sense who said, maybe you don't need this king guy. Maybe you need to be your own people. And when that happened, boom, minds blown. People started reading all the way up and down the coast. This was almost as big as the Bible. This was the most common read thing in America. January of 1776. Was there any coincidence that 6 months later came the Declaration of Independence? I think not.
Paine, who only had a few years of formal education, wrote Common Sense in a simple style that appealed to common folk who might neither understand nor appreciate the complex rhetoric of politicians. His accessible writing style reflected Enlightenment beliefs that everyone has a stake in their government and should have a say in it, not only the rich, educated, highborn, and elite. It's just common sense. Paine's little pamphlet full of big ideas, like full-scale revolt and freedom from British rule, was read in taverns and on street corners, galvanizing the idea of independence and prompting men to join the Continental Army, leading to eventual revolution. President John Adams acknowledged, without the pen of the author of Common Sense, the sword of Washington would have been raised in vain. In 1787, Paine wrote Rights of Man, a book that supported the impending French Revolution. He even traveled to France to support the overthrow of the French king. Paine never took a penny for this work, instead donating his profits to the revolutionary cause. He died a poor man in 1809 in New York, his history-changing contributions to the Revolutionary War long forgotten. Only 6 people attended his funeral.
But his ideas lived on. Not only that, his ideas that America became should be its own country sparked a revolution. This revolution. John Adams' speech.
President recognizes Mr. Adams of Massachusetts.
Objects of the most stupendous magnitude. Measures which will affect the lives of millions, born and unborn, are now before us. We must expect a great expense of blood to obtain them. But we must always remember that a free constitution of civil government cannot be purchased at too dear a rate, as there is nothing on this side of Jerusalem of greater importance to mankind.
Oh, yes. I'm good. How are you? Sorry.
Worthy colleague, Pennsylvania,
I'll just move inside the room.
John Adams
Great.
hears you.
ingenuity and eloquence. He has given you a grim prognostication of our national future. But where he foresees apocalypse, I see hope. I see a new nation ready to take its place in the world. Not an empire, but a republic. And a republic of laws, not men. Gentlemen, we are in the very midst of revolution, the most complete, unexpected, and remarkable of any in the history of the world.
That's right.
How few of the human race have ever had an opportunity of choosing a system of government for themselves and their children.
No king. We get to rule ourselves, separate from the
I am
king.
not
Came from Thomas Paine. But what about free press? Objectivity and bias. No such thing. The colonists and the British both tore down each other's presses. Nobody had any idea about this bias stuff that folks get hung up about today. They assumed that the press would be biased, that it would be partisan, that you would be mad. I mean, in a lot of ways, we're going back to where we were at the time of the revolution. None of this stuff, this whole idea of objectivity and balance and fairness, purely 20th century. We won't even deal with that for the next 100 years. Okay. After the revolution, you have the Confederation, 13 colonies, different sets of laws, rules, money, roads, taxes. They're all going their separate ways. The colonies realized they needed a central government, so they called the Constitutional Convention. Now, we're still fighting, having those same arguments. How much government do we need? Should we have a strong central government, or should the states have more rights? Well, that's what the Supreme Court has been trying to figure out for 200 years, but we see it every day in our personal lives, in our taxes.
200 years, soon to be 250 years.
With any luck at all, well, I hope so. 250 in 5 years. So let's hope. But yeah, stuff like, abortion rights. State of Texas says no, Supreme Court says maybe. That's right now, that's the big states' rights issue. So we're still wrestling with what the states do and what the government should do. However, you had, when they got together to write a better, stronger central government, Jefferson and Adams were in Europe. Washington was the president of the convention. Franklin was there, helped set up 3 branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial. But how far can the government go? In a monarchy, the king could do anything. But what about in a democracy, a real democracy? That's a question we still want today. Federalists want limits. They said, this is where the government can't go. Jefferson particularly, and Madison, wanted there to be a guarantee that the government can't go too far. So in order to pass the Constitution, the states passed a Bill of Rights, which means these are the things that you have the right to more than the government does. This is what government cannot.
Well, 12 amendments, although only 10 of those 12 were approved
Right, only 10
initially.
Thank you, Quentin, as usual. First Amendment. Congress, the first thing they said, no law respecting establishment of a religion, meaning we will not have a state religion. Why is that such a big deal to them? Anybody? Because they had a history of 100 years of civil war in England and in Europe. You had Protestants and Catholics fighting each other. You had the Puritans cut off the head of the king in the 1640s. They don't want those kind of fights. So they say, let's keep that out of it. But you can have your own religion any way you want. But that's the first thing. We're not going to have a state religion. The English have the Church of England, which is the Episcopalian Church in America. But we don't have that here. And then the next thing is abridging freedom of speech. Abridging means shortening, making a bridge. Which means that you are born with a right of free speech from God. And not only are we going to not deny it, we're not even going to shorten it. You have the right of free speech. Now, does that mean you can send a picture of your junk to somebody on a phone? I don't think the founders really were dealing with a lot of that stuff. So this is why we have a Supreme Court to work out whether or not, how do you apply this thought? Or freedom of the press. The difference between speech and the press, you can say whatever you want, but the press allows you to spread and disseminate thoughts and ideas, and for the right of people to peaceably assemble. And petition the government for grievances. Everyone forgets that last one. Okay, oh, there.
The First Amendment is one of the most important amendments to the Constitution,
If not the most.
if not the most important.
See, I told
It
you.
reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. To learn more about the First Amendment, I talked to two experts. Erwin Chemerinsky is the Jesse H. Choper Distinguished Professor of Law and Dean of Berkeley Law. Michael McConnell is the Director of the Constitutional Law Center at Stanford Law School and a Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. Professor Chemerinsky, there's a lot going on in the First Amendment. Can you tell us a little bit more about why the framers chose to protect these rights in particular?
The historical background of the First Amendment of the Constitution shows why the framers wanted to be sure that all of the liberties in the First Amendment were safeguarded. Let's focus on freedom of speech and freedom of the press. In England, there was, after the printing press developed, licensing, so that anyone who wanted to be able to publish anything needed a license from the government. Such licensing was seen to be.
Yeah, because if you did something the king didn't like, you could lose your license. So much for free speech.
Inconsistent with freedom of speech, freedom of the press, for that matter, freedom of thought, freedom of inquiry.
Interesting. Okay, so there are a lot of essential freedoms that are packed into this First Amendment, so much that it's almost amazing that we're going to attempt to talk about them all in one video. But if we dial into freedom of speech, Professor McConnell, what is freedom of speech? Does that encompass some things and not others?
Well, freedom of speech was actually less important to the framers than the freedom with which it was coupled, which is the freedom of the press. And the reason for this is that speech that can reach large audiences is much more important to the individual, but also dangerous to the state than mere speech. When you speak, only those people within hearing range can hear you. But when you are able to use Gutenberg's fantastic new technology to publish your sentiments and distribute them widely, maybe even over the entire country or across the Atlantic and reaching hundreds and thousands of people, now that is powerful. And no wonder, so you think about how the American Revolution was won. This required spreading the word. It required gaining converts and telling people what their grievances were. To a very great extent, this was done through the mechanism of the printing press.
When you ask the question of what's freedom of speech, there's implicit within it the issue of what do we mean by speech? Ultimately, the answer to your question is that the First Amendment in protecting speech broadly safeguards a right to express one's ideas, but it's not absolute. The government can restrict expression if there's a compelling interest.
Interesting. Can you say more about that?
The Supreme Court always has been clear that freedom of speech is not absolute. The court has said that there are certain categories of speech that are unprotected by the First Amendment. Incitement of illegal activity is a category of unprotected speech. The court has said this requires showing that the speech was directed at causing imminent illegal activity, and there was a
See, directed at causing activity. It's one thing to say, I don't like what the government does. It's another thing to say, go out and break into the Capitol.
likelihood of imminent illegal activity. Another example, obscenity is unprotected by the First Amendment. The court struggled for years with trying to
But what
define
is
what is obscenity. Maybe the low point in that is when Justice Potter Stewart said, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. There are also these categories of speech where the government can prohibit and even punish the expression.
That's where most of the limitations on the freedom of speech and of the press come from, is in order to make sure that we don't hurt other people's rights through the use of our own. So an example of that, the government can prohibit speech which incites violence against someone. So
Again, speech is one thing, action is another. And when you cross the line saying, boy, I'm mad is one thing. Boy, I'm gonna punch you right now. That's where you cross the line.
you're making a speech and calling upon the crowd to attack somebody's house or their person, that can be punished and prevented as an incitement to violence. And you can see how that follows from the logical idea of freedom of speech being a natural right and therefore limited by the rights of other people.
So let's turn our attention toward the freedom of religion part of the First Amendment. So the first thing that the amendment says is about establishment. So what does this establishment clause prevent?
The language of the First Amendment is important. It says that Congress may make no law respecting the establishment of religion. Since 1947, the Supreme Court has said that it also applies to state and local governments. And the Supreme Court has said this means that the government cannot act with the purpose of advancing religion.
To the founders, this was a very clear legal concept, namely it was the established Church of England. In the statute books, in the law, the Church of England was referred to as, and I quote, the church by law established. And what did it mean to be established? First of all, it meant that the doctrines of the church, the 39 articles of faith of the Church of England, were voted upon by Parliament. So the doctrines, the liturgy, the text were all adopted by law.
Yeah, I mean, that's not really relevant to this course, except I wanted you to understand that, again, you had a state religion in England, and we didn't want that here. And that is the first thing in the Constitution, in the First Amendment. Now, does that mean you can't have prayer in your school? Supreme Court said yes. So that, because especially if this is a Christian prayer, this may be a country founded by Christians, but that doesn't mean we have a state religion that is Christianity. So
You could practice this probably the most ridiculous religion out there, Aaron, and it would still be protected.
This is what courts are for. For example, there was a church in Florida, a church that part of their sacrament was to get this big ganja spliff man and pass around a big fatty, a whole big marijuana cigarette. And that's not legal, but they claimed, hey, separation of church and state. Federal government stepped in and said, no, can't do that. So there are times when, like, human sacrifice, you can't do. So there are limits even on that. Okay, free breath. Okay, okay, let me scroll down. Oh, that's right, I'm on this one. Okay, all right. So the thing is, the First Amendment, as far as freedom of speech and press, was fuzzy. It was a concept. Again, could they see cyberbullying coming? No. Does that fit into free speech? They left that to us. The one thing that they did agree on was that they did not like prior restraint. What's prior restraint? Prior restraint goes way, way back. It's basically prior restraint is censorship. It is allowing the government to print something before, to censor something before it goes in print, having a government censor. That's like having a license. Once it goes out and someone's hurt, then you can get in trouble. But you have to wait until the damage is done. Famous one here is the Pentagon Papers from 1970, in which the Washington Post and the New York Times found out that we exaggerated our own efforts and undercounted the North Vietnamese, and the government lied to us about what was going on in Vietnam. Nixon tried to stop them from printing, saying that would undermine the war effort. The Supreme Court says, sorry, that's prior restraint. You have to let the press be free, even if it causes some damage. So they're real big on that. That's the one thing that the founders agreed on. They do not want the government to be a censor. Well, what does that say about political speech? Well, we got an answer in 1798, 11 years after the Constitution was passed, under Adams, who made that lovely speech earlier, that the government can jail people for criticizing the government. Again, total opposite of the Zenger trial. That they're able to, again, jail people for criticizing the government. Jefferson criticized Adams, then Jefferson put people in jail for criticizing him. So much for dissent and speaking truth to power. So did Lincoln. Lincoln cut down Southern printing presses, suspended habeas corpus, put people in jail without charge. Lincoln was called a dictator. So sometimes governments go further than we do in the Constitution. How do we figure that out? Our courts take it on a case-by-case basis, and it's still that way today. Okay, covered free speech in one session. So what we will do, and I'll write a note about this, we will have a 5-point in-class workshop applying these. I have a set of things that happen on campus. Can a campus, for example, at a football game, say ban the F word from a student banner? You know, things like that. We'll ask about free speech on campus next time, and I'll go down a few things, and we'll just like start thinking about these things. And there may be a question or two on the test like that, but I'm going to limit them. So we will do an in-class workshop, and I'll put it online when we're done so people can still participate. And I'll give you 5 points for participating. I'll go over them. I'll go over the issues. I'll give you 5 points for participating during or after class. And I'll show you how that works next time. And next Tuesday, we will have, at Tuesday the 30th, we will have, or the 29th, whatever day it is, we will have a review on the test. And next Wednesday through next Wednesday onward.
Did you say Tuesday or Thursday?
Tuesday, 1 week from today.
So that would be the 28th.
28th. Thank you, Quentin. And like I said, a lot of the answers will be on the review sheet. I will not ask for as much application this time. Other questions? All right. We will see you on Thursday. All right. Peace out, dude.